Okay. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce the sixth speaker in the series of Turing Award winners for work that was done at Berkeley. Today, I'm going to introduce, I get to have Mike Stonebraker give the talk, and he, like me, has gotten his award relatively recently, so we're going to hear his actual Turing lecture that he gave a couple of years ago. So, as I said in email, Mike is the serial entrepreneur of the Turing Laureates. He's founded 9 companies, remarkably. That might be the equal to all the other 50 Turing Laureates right there. But, he's got an academic track record as well, including both master's students and PhD students. People he's advised is Mike Carey, who's a professor at University of California at Irvine and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. Diane Green, who's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and she's the Google Cloud CEO, is also the former CEO of VMware. Marty Hurst, our colleague in the iSchool and here in the ECS. Joe Hellerstein, right up here front, and then Margot Seltzer, who used to be chair at Harvard in computer science and now is at University of Columbia. So he's got both an amazing entrepreneurial research and mentorship track record. And today, I'm sure we're going to hear just 1 or 2 opinions by Mike on the future on the future of database technology. Welcome.
So Dave said I had to give my Turing Award talk, which is 3 years ago. And so this is exactly what you're going to hear. And if you've watched it on YouTube, you're going to be disappointed. And I'm sorry, but ask the guy in the front row why I'm doing this talk. And I'm not going to talk about the future of databases either, because that's not you can ask questions. So anyway, I have to admit that my fantasy was to win the Turing Award for quite a while before it happened. And I had sort of planned a very non-traditional paper and talk. And this is my once-in-a-lifetime chance to actually do it without the reviewers getting to say anything. And in fact, ACM was not pleased with the talk I chose. So here it is. In order to understand this talk, you need to know just a little bit about relational databases. So this is now sort of old hat to most of you, I hope. So in 1970, Codd wrote his pioneering CACM paper, which you should all read because it's of historical significance. He said all data should be stored in tables, simplest possible data structure, and then accessed in a declarative high-level language. All of this sounds like very reasonable these days. And in the 1970s, there were 2 projects to build relational database systems, System R from IBM Research, and us building Ingres. And so they were full-function database systems embodying Ted Codd's ideas. So that's all you need to know. So anyway, the land sharks are on the Squawk box, or the subtitle is Why Riding a Bicycle Across America and Building Postgres Have a Lot in Common. So the land sharks are on the Squawk box. Illustra, which was the commercial version of Postgres, is down to fumes, and it falls to me to try and raise some more money, another round of financing from our venture capital backers, who I affectionately call the land sharks. Unfortunately, I'm at a family event in rural Maine, and this is where I was. And so I'm this is before the days of cell phones, so I'm on a rotary phone in the hall, dragging the cord into the bathroom so I can negotiate with the VCs who are on the Squawk box, which is a Polycom. So the conversation is depressingly familiar. The VCs say lower stock price, more money. I say higher stock price, less money. And eventually we reach an agreement, and Illustra will live to fight another day. So this is an intertwined story, the green one and the blue one. The green one is a cross-country bicycle ride that my wife and I did in the summer of 1988. The blue one is the design, building, and ultimate commercialization of Postgres, which occurred over a decade in the late 1980s and early 1990s. As you'll see, both start off on a very high note, but there are multiple speed bumps in front of both of these endeavors. So here we are at the ferry terminal in Anacortes, Washington. This is my wife and I starting off. Our goal is to ride up the North Cascades Scenic Highway. Our destination is Boston, some 3,500 bicycle miles away. We are in a very uptone mood. It does not faze us that we have never ridden a tandem before. This tandem has been ridden once for about 10 miles and is already having bugs in the construction. It doesn't faze us that we've never been on a bicycle trip longer than 5 days. And what's in front of us is vastly more than that. It doesn't faze us that we've never ridden in the mountains, and nothing like the mountains directly in front of us. It also doesn't faze us that we have along with us our 18-month-old daughter, and we have no idea how she's going to deal with the summer on the road. We're in really high spirits. We're off on a great adventure. Right here in 1984, I told you about Ingress. It was an academic project built here. We commercialized it in 1980, and it's now 4 years later, and commercial Ingress is wildly better code than the academic prototype. And it makes no sense to continue prototyping on our academic code line. So I make the painful decision to push the code over the cliff and start something new. So what is Postgres going to be? Well, the first thing that I was clear was probably a good idea was something called abstract data types, mentioned in the Turing Award citation. And where this came from is Ingress and SystemR were singularly focused on business data processing, which is do what the competition, namely Codicil and a commercial system from IBM called IMS, do what they did and do it better. So then that was business data processing. So we designed Ingress to be a business data processing database system. And so it had the standard business types. You know, it had character strings, it had integers, that stuff. By 1984, this is 4 years later from after commercialization, and 10 years later than the original design, there had been a large collection of papers of the form, well, this relational database stuff is supposed to be good. And in fact, I was a complete evangelist on spreading the word. Well, we tried this stuff on problem X, and it didn't work. And so to make it work, we added Y to the relational model. Some X's were computer-aided design, library automation systems, stuff out of the mainstream of business data processing. And so relational databases were completely brittle. But I could see that there was a unique Y for every X, and that relational databases were going to die from 1,000 extensions. So that's clearly not the way to do it. So a trivial example from GIS, which was one of the application areas, Geographic Information Systems. So imagine that you have a bunch of employees, and you have the home address of each of them, and you have the home address as a rectangle, which is the plot of land on which their house is built. Well, if you want to get a zoning variance from your local city to do something unusual, you have to ask everyone within a certain distance of where this is going to be. And so a perfectly reasonable query that the zoning guys want to ask is, find me the people who overlap a specific rectangle, which is the rectangle in question, spread out by the distance that it has to be away. So by then, by 1984, query languages were great. In SQL, the way to express this query is on the middle of the slide. Practically nobody, I always get challenged by somebody who says the query is not correct. Trust me, it is correct. So, but the thing to take away is that it's messy to write the query. No one believes this at first blush, that it actually works. Also, if you happen to know anything about databases, you can see that there's a bunch of predicates in the where clause, and they're all one-sided comparisons against a constant, which means it's going to be difficult to optimize this query. So it's messy and difficult to optimize. And that was true over any number of application areas. So for some reason, I said, well, a better solution is if you could have a location be a geographic box instead of 4 numbers. So you have some internal representation for a data type called location, which is of type box. At which point, instead of having 7 fields in this query, you have Sam, my favorite example from my colleague at MIT, his age, and an internal representation for a box. At which point, if you want to write this query, you want the names of people whose location, which is this box, overlaps a specific rectangle. And now it's obvious that this query does what you want it to do. And all you need is a box data type and a make box function to allow you to construct boxes, and an overlaps function. So basically, in general, to do this query in a nice way, you want user-defined data types that are known to the database system, in this case, rectangles. In general, you want lines, points, polygons, all that stuff. You need user-defined operators, namely, in this case, overlaps. So the normal operators like plus, minus, you need to extend that with other stuff. And then you need user-defined functions to be able to construct boxes out of simpler data types. So you have to add all this stuff to a database engine and then call it at the appropriate times. So that was the general idea, is allow the type system to be extendable with whatever you wanted. Of course, the devil is in the details. And so you have to be able to use your new data types in indexes, which the database system has, B trees and hashing. You need to have new indexes. Spatial indexes these days are things like R star trees, R trees. You need to teach the query optimizer about all this new stuff. You've got to specify commutivity rules, because database systems make use of that. And if you ever have a query that says not age greater than 10, the database system will automatically translate that into age less than or equal to 10. So you need to optimize not. There's a bunch of other stuff. So the devil is in the details. The idea is very simple, but this was what was in front of us, was work out the details. So that's the first thing Postgres was going to bet on. So back to our bike ride. We're in Winthrop, Washington. It's day 3. Here I am, along with Mary Ann, who is driving our car as a support vehicle. and our daughter Leslie. And it's about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and I can just barely stand up. Why is that? Well, today started at 5 a.m. in Devils Lake, Washington. We proceeded to ride uphill for 50 miles. Along the way, we rose 5,000 feet into the Cascades. It got really cold. We put on every piece of bicycle gear we had. Then it started to rain, and then it started to snow. Finally, exhausted, wet, and cold, we get to the top of aptly named Rainy Pass. Here we are. And we're not done yet, because after about a short downhill, we have to climb another 1,000 feet to the top of Washington Pass. And here we are at the top of Washington Pass, wearing every piece of bicycle gear we own, or that we've brought with us. And of course, after that, there's a glorious downhill on the eastern side of the pass. On a tandem bike, since there are 2 people and a lot of mass, the bicycle is like shot out of a cannon. And fortunately, we'd had the foresight to have an extra drum brake on the bike. So I'm dragging on the drum brake, hoping it won't break. And we get down to Winthrop, and I'm exhausted, and my legs are feeling like jelly. But I'm really elated, because we're over the first 2 passes. There are a lot more mountains in front of us, but we've proved we can do the mountains. So back to Berkeley, and this was the second idea Postgres was going to bet on. And Chris Date wrote a pioneering paper on referential integrity in 1982. And it's basically what to do with foreign key, primary key constraints. And we can look at this with a very simple example. 2 trivial tables, a table of departments and a table of employees. If we look at the employee table, it's got a department column in it, it's called a foreign key. And it's basically a pointer to the primary key in the other table. So the problem is, what happens if I delete the candy department out of the department table? Well, then I'm left with a dangling pointer in Art's record, which now doesn't point anywhere. So what to do to fix up this situation? So Chris Date wrote a paper on this, and he had 6 different things you should do on inserts and deletes. Pick how you wanted the semantics to go. And that was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And if you think about it for a minute, this is a little simple rule system on what to do when you delete a department, what to do if you add an employee who isn't in a real department. So it's a little rule system. And the trouble is, by then, referential integrity was one example of several rule systems that you should support. Another one was triggers. There's a lot of activity back then. If you give Joey Hellerstein a raise, then you want to cascade his salary to Dave Patterson, which is if he gets a raise, then do something to fix up how life ought to be. Integrity constraints. Database system tries to keep garbage out of the database. If you try and give Joey a negative salary, you want the system to say, no, thank you, you can't do that. It's not allowed. And so these are 3 examples of rule systems. And it's pretty clear that if you were building a database system, you were going to be building several of these one-off special case rule systems. So I said that can't possibly be the right way to do things. And moreover, I hate if-then-else rule systems. This was the time of Conniver and Planner. The AI guys were focused on rule engines. And the trouble is, rule systems have horrible semantics if you're a database person. So just consider 2 simple rules. First one is make sure George is in the shoe department. That's where he belongs. regardless of what any query says. And the second rule is move everybody over 40 from shoe to candy. Okay, so let's take George. Suppose he's over 40, and let's apply these two rules. Apply the first one, says whatever department George is in, move him to the shoe department. Second rule says if you're over 40, move him back to candy. So George ends up in the candy department. Apply the rules in the other order and move up everybody who's over 40 from shoe to candy. Okay, you move George into the candy department. And then the first rule says put him in the shoe department. So if you run the two rules top down, you get one answer. If you run the bottom up, you get a different answer. That gives database systems designers real headaches. You don't want database operations to be order specific. Big thing about relational database systems is they didn't do that. So I hated if-then-else systems because SQL was entirely based on being order independent. Second thing I hate about rule systems is this was also the time of the 5th generation Japanese computing project, which says we're going to write everything in Prolog. And so a bunch of us looked at Prolog programs. If I hand you a 20-line Prolog program, no mere mortal can figure out what it does. So this stuff doesn't scale. So you can't figure out what happens, with rules of this sort. So I wasn't going to do any of that. So my solution was to say, why don't we just tag updates with an always modifier? And so what always does is the semantics are the update command appears to be perpetually running, although you're not going to implement it that way. So if you want to make sure Bill has the same salary as Sam, well, the update does the right thing. And if you tag it with always, then forever that update appears to be running and will do the right thing. So this is somewhat cleaner than an if-then-else system, and at least it was different than the conventional wisdom at the time. So we're going to bet on the always command. Back to our bike ride. Here we are at Marias Pass, Montana. It's day 15, it's warm, and we're at the Continental Divide. The endless climbs in the Cascades and the Rockies are all behind us. We look out to the east, and all you can see is the Great Plains stretching out for miles and miles. It is now downhill to Chicago. And we are in an uptone mood. Here you can see our daughter Leslie and the two of us. So life is good. We're over all the mountains. Well, the third Postgres idea was if you looked at the way Ingress and most database systems work, you have a database system which is a bunch of code, and you have this round can, which is the storage of data on the disk. So you all think of a database system as managing the data as it sits on the disk, but life is much more complicated than that. The database system also has to maintain a log, and that's a separate storage system. And the reason it needs a log is that if you crash in the middle of a transaction, you've got to either back out or finish the transaction. And so to do that, you need a log of what you've done so far. So you have two database systems, in fact, to do crash recovery. One is the data, and the other is the log. And they have different access methods, different access patterns, and they must be very carefully synchronized, because if you update the data, you've got to update the log first, or you can't recover. Log code is complicated and very ugly. Moreover, it's really hard to test, because you can't say, well, let's crash the database system right now so we can see if it can recover. So if you look at this from a software engineering point of view, this is a nightmare. You've got code that is complicated and ugly and asynchronous and difficult to test. And if it doesn't work, then you can't recover the database. And if you can't recover the database and it's an important client, then you land on the front page of the New York Times. So log code done this way is really ugly. So there ought to be a better way to run this railroad. And so Postgres decided on a different way to do this. We said, why don't we merge the log with the data? So if we're going to give Joey a raise, a normal database system will overwrite his salary with a new value, and then you've got to put some footprints in the log so you can recover. Well, suppose we just don't overwrite his salary, but we add a new record with his new salary and timestamp everything so you can sort it out. So that gets rid of crash recovery code, essentially completely. You just run the database system, and if it stops, well, you pick up, start again when you bring it back up. Also has a nice feature that if you want to ask what was Joey's salary 5 days ago, you can go find it from past records that are time-stamped correctly. So this seemed like a really good idea. It gets rid of a bunch of horrible code and gives you a much cleaner and simpler system. Of course, like everything else in database stuff, the devil's in the details. The log is write optimized because you want to just append records into the log as fast as you can. The data is, of course, read optimized. You got to be able to find Joey quickly. So if you have one system that does both, it's difficult to make things both read optimized and write optimized. And it's got to be competitive with the traditional way of doing things. So it's a tricky placement problem. So that was what we signed up to solve. And so the Postgres game plan, circa 1985, we're going to bet on abstract data types. We're going to bet on having a rule system using this always command. And we're going to bet on no overwrite storage. Now, Joey, who was around at the time, will tell you there's a bunch of other stuff. But to me, this was the important stuff. So that was the Postgres game plan. And we were off and running, building a new database system. Well, of course, both of these, the green and the blue, started out on a high point, but it didn't take very long for things not to go very well. So things aren't going very, very well in both of these endeavors. On the bicycle ride, we got to North Dakota. So, and we've been riding for 3.5 weeks at this point. And as you can see, North Dakota is perfectly flat and there are no trees. And so riding in North Dakota has the following feel to it. Up ahead, 10 miles away, you see a grain elevator. You ride toward the grain elevator for 3/4 of an hour. You come into a little town, the grain elevator is right there. You keep riding. Up ahead, 10 miles away, you see the next grain elevator. It is monotonous riding. It's really boring. And my wife joked to me that the state tree of North Dakota should be the telephone pole. But it turns out that wasn't what was killing us. We could deal with the monotony. What was killing us was the wind. Ordinarily, the Great Plains, the wind is howling from west to east. You sit up straight in the saddle of your bicycle, and the wind blows you across North Dakota at 16, 17, 18 miles an hour. Well, this summer, the wind was howling all right, but it was howling from east to west. We were riding into gale force winds, and we struggled to make 7 miles an hour. So for days on end, we were making 7 miles an hour, and that was really depressing. Came to a head in a little town in the middle of the state called Drake. The objective for that day was to get to Harvey, and 42 miles into our bike ride that day, we didn't have any energy to go any further. Harvey is still 25 miles away, and we weren't going to make it. More ominously, it's still 300 miles to the tree line and the Minnesota border, and I have no idea how we're going to get there. Well, back to Postgres. About 1986, reality really sets in a bad way. First of all, we had coded Ingress in C. Well, C++ wasn't ready. Ada seemed to be a fringe kind of thing. We said we don't want to code Postgres in C. We'll try coding Postgres in Lisp. Remember, this is the Japanese AI 5th generation stuff. That was the high point. The AI guys were all saying Lisp is fantastic. Of course, Lisp was a total and unmitigated disaster. It's like 2 orders of magnitude too slow. And so the minute we realized it, essentially all the code went over the cliff. And we started building Postgres anew in C. The ADT system looks great. The reason I know that is there was a commercial Ingress company, and I got a call one day from a New York investment banking IT person. And this was right after commercial Ingress had released date and time as a data type. And of course, the ANSI semantics for date and time was implement the Gregorian calendar. So if you subtract February 15th from March 15th, you're supposed to get 28 days except during leap year, except during double leap year. So this guy called me up and said, you implemented time wrong. And I said, oh, tell me more. So it turns out he was calculating interest on financial bonds. And for whatever crazy reason, the bond market in the US, at least at the time, worked in such that you got the same amount of interest in every month, regardless of how long the month was. So if you subtracted February 15th from March 15th, his answer was 30 days, thank you very much. And you couldn't argue with him. That's the way his application worked. So he was forced to read the data out of the database system, calculate minus in application code, and then put everything back. So a factor of 3 slower than if he could use minus in the database system. So all he wanted was, let me overload minus. And that was something Postgres could do in a heartbeat. But of course, Ingress couldn't do it. So that was my first inkling that abstract data types were going to be a really good idea. Time travel was a lot of fun, but it really was tricky to optimize. And always didn't work at all. It didn't work at all because I had decided that a litmus test for a rule system was you had to be able to do Chris Date's 6 different semantics for referential integrity, and always couldn't do it. So more data, more code goes over the cliff, and we go back to exploring a much more conventional looking rule system. So that was kind of a bit downer. And over the next 3 years, the wine connoisseur and I spent a lot of time on how do we salvage all this stuff. How complex can complex objects do? What to do about time travel? How do we make it perform well enough? What are we going to do about rule systems? Think of these 3 years as a lot of repair, or think of it as a slog through the swamp. Well, bad things don't last forever. Both projects returned to a high point. So what happened next? So we left off the bike ride in Drake, North Dakota, with me trying to figure out how we're going to make it to the tree line. So here we are in Carrington, North Dakota, another little town. And it's the next afternoon, and God was on our side today. It didn't have anything to do with the wind. The wind was still howling from east to west. Serendipity was my brother, who's pictured here in the white shirt. So my brother had shown up to ride with us for a few days. Marianne picked him up at the Minot, North Dakota airport with his bicycle. He is fresh, he is a strong bike rider, and he has not been worn down by the North Dakota winds. So what happened was he rode in front of us just like in the bicycle races, and we drafted him. And I know it's supposed to be the tandem gets drafted by the single bike, but we drafted him. And so drafting someone is really hard if you have a tandem, because you have to ride 3 inches from their rear wheel. So speed up a little, slow down a little, speed up. Try not to hit their wheel, because that sends you off into the wheat fields. So for 82 miles, faster, slower, we drafted my brother and we got to Carrington. And it's now obvious that we will get out of North Dakota 3 inches behind his wheel if necessary. So after a lot of slogging through the swamp, Postgres works well enough to commercialize. And you might say, why commercialize it? And the answer is, in the DBMS field, the ultimate arbiter of good ideas is the commercial marketplace. So either you have to convince a big company to implement your ideas, or you need to do a startup. And there's a great book called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. It should be required reading for anyone who wants to think about commercializing anything. And basically, we did a startup, and we raised VC money. So we recruited Mom and her husband, the short one. EMP1 and the quiet one came over from the academic team, joined shortly thereafter by Triple Rock, with the tall shark as interim CEO and lead investor. We were often running in the honeymoon phase of a startup. Life is great. You know, you have money, you have a mission, which is to make your stuff work well enough to sell. So we had set about converting the query language to SQL, hardening the code, improving performance. Life is good. Here we are in Luddington, Michigan. We have just hauled our bike, which we call Boston Bound, off the Lake Michigan ferry. The endless upper Midwest is behind us. It is now less than 1,000 miles to Boston. It's beginning to look like we're going to make it. After a couple of miscues, commercial Postgres is named Illustra. We got the first few customers. That's the first thing a commercial entity startup has to do. We raised more money. See the slide number 1 from Kennebago, Maine. We hired a real executive team, the voice of experience, uptone, and smooth. The future is really looking up. Life is good. Both projects are doing great, but of course that doesn't last. What happens to the bike trip? We hit the Allegheny Mountains. We've been lulled by flat ground. North Dakota is flat, Minnesota is flat, Michigan is flat, Ohio is flat. But you hit the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania, it is not flat. Moreover, the Alleghenies, they don't believe in switchbacks. You go up and down the same 500 feet over and over again. It's exhausting. So we stayed in Ellicottville, New York, and I went to the innkeeper with the following very simple question. How do we get to Albany without climbing any more hills? Commercial Postgres hit a horrible speed bump in 1994. So I said abstract data types were the fundamental key thing in Postgres. So the whole sales pitch for Postgres, commercial Postgres, was you can go a lot faster with ADTs, your code is a lot simpler, move some of your application into the database as ADTs, and life is great. So that was the sales pitch. And we'd written a geographic set of data types, time types. We'd written some basic types. And we started to peddle that to customers. And they all said, no, thank you. And why did they say no, thank you? Well, the GIS ones said, we don't want your GIS data types. We want data types from the large GIS vendors, people like ArcInfo and MapInfo. So they didn't want our data types. They wanted the ones from the large application vendors. So we said, okay, that should be fine. So I made a whole bunch of pilgrimages to Redlands, California, to talk to Jack Dangerman, who's the CEO of Artfo. And I gave him the same sales pitch. I said, look, move some of your code into the database system. You get all these joins, you put in new data, you get transactions. Life is great. He looked at me like I was crazy and said, how many customers do you have? And I said, well, 20. And he said, come back when you have 5,000. And the problem was, he viewed us as a possible distribution channel, meaning we could provide him a lot of customers to sell to. We viewed him as enabling our customers. So we had a catch-22, which is we needed to get customers. They wanted data type support from the app vendors. The app vendors wanted to see customers in order to spend the effort to put their stuff into our database system. Total catch-22. So we said, holy crap, what do we do now? So we're pondering that, and then the rest of reality sets in, which is sales are not going very well, as you can probably imagine. And so we run out of money, and now life is really bad. It's bad because when you finance a startup, you expect to sell stock to the VCs, you make some progress, you sell some more stock at a higher price, you make some more progress, you sell stock at a yet higher price. Well, what happens if you're not making progress in the eyes of the investor? They said, you're not even worth what we paid in the last round. You can't have a flat round. It's going to be a down round. And the trouble with a down round, number one, is very dilutive to the insiders because you have to sell stock at a lower price. But worse than that, most of the agreements between VCs and the management team has a provision that says if there's a down round, then the previous round has to be repriced down to whatever the new price is. That's even more dilutive. So we were facing extreme dilution. So of course, being smart people, we said, we're out of here. It's your company. Do whatever you want to with it. Of course, the VCs don't want that solution. So what you end up with is a zero-sum negotiation between you and the VCs over ownership in the new circumstances. This is a fate worse than death. Negotiating against the VC midstream is really painful. So we go through a very, very painful period of restructuring and refinancing the company. When the dust settles, the positions of the various VCs has changed very little. And in my point of view is we spent a lot of time and a lot of energy with the VCs sort of engaged in some sort of silly game against each other. Anyway, life is not good. Well, of course, that doesn't last forever either. So we left the bike ride in Ellicottville saying, how do we get to Albany without climbing any more hills? And the innkeeper gave us advice that would have been obvious to Robert Fulton. And what the innkeeper said was straight north to the Erie Canal and hang a right. And that's what we did. It was hot riding down the Mohawk Valley. There's all kinds of Rust Belt cities that are not very much fun to ride through, but we didn't have to climb any hills. And so here we are at the Massachusetts River. And if you look at Wildcat Canyon Road, in Orinda, at the bottom of Wildcat Canyon Road, there's a sign painted on the pavement that says the last hill. And if you're a bicycle rider and you're in the East Bay and you need to come back to Berkeley, Wildcat Road is the last hill. After that, it's downhill to Berkeley. So we are at our last hill. All we have to do is climb the Berkshires to North Adams, and then it's easy riding to Boston. Now a mere 186 miles away. So what happened to commercial Postgres? They had a bit of serendipity, which is 1995 was exactly when the internet was taking off. So that was when Bill Gates went to Cornell, got religion, internet, and it was the new thing that everybody was interested in. Sort of like the 1995 version of machine learning. So the internet is taking off. So Uptone, our marketing guy, turns the company on a dime, says we're in abstract data types and extendable databases. That's not what we do. We're the database for cyberspace. And we get a lot of buzz. And life is looking up. Maybe we've turned the corner, and the hockey stick of growth is in front of us. And in fact, Netscape, which was the major internet player at the time, came to talk to us and said, we need a database system. And so we were invited to the party to bake off against traditional vendors, but we at least had a seat at the table. So life was good for both of these endeavors. Well, commercial Postgres had one more speed bump to go through. So the internet bake-off reality set in again. How did that happen? Well, Netscape was going to bake us off against all the popular relational database systems. And we said, well, of course you want to do something that involves text or GIS or images or internet data. And Netscape says, no, we're you off on TPC-B, which was business data processing, cash a check. And we said, well, why would you want to do that? And they said, well, buried inside any one of your kind of problems, there's a conventional business data processing problem. We went first. So transaction processing is not something Postgres has never been optimized for. We're optimized for doing all this fancy new stuff. In transaction processing, we were going to lay an egg, and we were going to lay an egg badly. So we were going to lose this benchmark in a big way. And there doesn't seem to be anything we can do about it. And so we're invited to the party, but then spurned. So how did both of these sagas end up? Well, turns out we're aiming for Boston. If you've ever been to Boston, you can see that it's ridiculous to ride a tandem bicycle through downtown Boston, let alone try and find some way to get down to the Atlantic Ocean so that you can dip your front wheel in the ocean. So we elect to go to Wollaston Beach, which is about 10 miles south of Boston in Quincy. And here we are, midday of day 59. The bike ride is over, and we are elated. Well, what happened to Postgres? Well, it turned out, we lost the benchmark in a big. But one of the main relational database vendors sort of realized that you had to support text and images and geography and all this other stuff. And so he was threatened enough by what was happening that he decided to buy us. And so that's all of our problems. First of all, the catch-22 problem was ADT, people who would provide ADTs wanted a big enough market so that it would be interesting. Well, the vendor that bought us had a large market. It allowed us to solve the transaction processing problem because that vendor already had a high-speed transaction engine. So this was a marriage made in heaven. We allowed ourselves to be purchased and set about putting Illustra features into their system. And so it ends on an uptone. So now I want to make a bunch of comments about what I've just told you. So why would I tell you a bicycle story? So here's an algorithm for riding across the United States. So until you get to the ocean, get up in the morning, ride east, and persevere and overcome any rise. And I guarantee you that if you follow this algorithm, you'll make it across the country. Well, you guys are all into abstraction. So let's apply a little bit of abstraction here. Until you get to whatever your goal is, the Atlantic Ocean or whatever it is, up in the morning and take an action that gets you moving toward this goal. In our case, it was ride east. If you have some other goal, then the action is goal appropriate. And persevere and overcome any obstacles that arise. So general algorithm for achieving a goal. Well, let's encapsulate this into a macro, which I call make it happen. Okay, so why would anyone want to ride a bicycle across America? It's long and hard. There's nothing fun about North Dakota. Pure passion and elation, and lots of slog through the swamp. It's 3,500 miles. We rode every inch of it. So why would anyone in their right mind want to do this? Well, let's look at my career. So here's a capsulated summary. So I'm from the University of Michigan. What's a PhD like? Well, it's a lot of hard work. It's long and hard. Has periods of depression. I failed prelims the first time. Periods of elation, you get out. More or less, it's make it happen for 5 years. Some people take longer. I took 5 years. So then you take an assistant professor job at here, and now you have 5 years to get famous, and you either get tenure or they fire you. And so it's long and hard. It's really difficult to get tenure. It has periods of depression. Your paper gets turned down. Has periods of elation. Your paper gets accepted. And it's a more make it happen, in this case, for about 5 years. So what's the bike ride? It's make it happen for a couple of months. An obvious conclusion to be drawn here, which is I obviously am wired to look for opportunities to make it happen, and that must be what I enjoy in life. So what's that got to do with Postgres? Well, look at Postgres. Have a good idea or two or three. You got to build a prototype. That's make it happen for a few years. Start a company, hire some implementers, hire some execs, and that's make it happen for 5 more years or so. So Postgres is have a good idea and then make it happen for a decade. Well, who in their right mind that? It's hard, it's long, it has periods of depression, periods of elation. The answer is only somebody who's wired to want to make it happen, like me. So my personal thought on good ideas. Postgres had at least one. I've never had any good ideas by communing with nature on the mountaintop. Never. Instead, where I seem to get good ideas is by talking with users, talking to some more users, and critical environment of smart people. So if you don't have this, I'd recommend you find it. And if you haven't talked to any users, I'd recommend shoe leather to go find users and talk to them. Now, if you want my current take on database ideas circa 3 years, there's a test of time talk at ICDE 15. Go listen to the talk. It's not going to be part of this talk. So where does make it happen come from? So I think if you don't have it, you're not going to succeed as an assistant professor. You're certainly not going to succeed riding across the United States. So where does this come from? At this point, I could delve into psychology, but that's way above my pay grade. So I can simply say I have no idea. But if you don't have it, it's going to be hard to do this. And what about serendipity? Well, Serendipity was crucial in North Dakota. If my brother hadn't showed up, I'm not sure what would have happened. It was really important to Illustra. If the internet hadn't come along, the outcome would have been very different. So it's often a very significant factor, and it's not, as is anti-serendipity. So one of my companies was screwed by Google, and there was nothing you could do about it. So you may have good things could happen, bad things could happen. It's the luck of the draw. Okay, what's happening in present? Our tandem bicycle sits in our basement gathering dust. It's never been ridden since Wollaston Beach. I refuse to let my wife sell it. And so it sits in our basement gathering dust. I still am in to make it happen. Most climbing the 48 4,000-foot mountains in New Hampshire. Illustra was successfully integrated into the Informix code base and is still available as we speak. Postgres abstract data types have been added to almost all relational data. It's basically table stakes if you want to sell a relational database system. And then the biggest piece of serendipity was a collection of random pickup programmers with no relationship to Berkeley and no relationship to me. Picked up the open source version of Postgres from Berkeley and have shepherded it for the last 25 years. Pure serendipity, a perfect example of open source development at its best. So the fact that Postgres is so successful largely due to this open source community of developers who've maintained it all these years. Postgres code has also formed the starting point for several database startups, including Greenplum and a bunch of others. So open source is great that anybody can pick it up with a new idea. I'm still building database systems. I'm a firm believer in one size doesn't fit all. In the last decade or so, I built 3 of them. C-Store that turned into Vertica, H-Store that turned into VoltDB, DB which turned into Paradigm 4. Each of these has been a decade and counting. I could have used any one of those for this talk. They all have the same kind of characteristics. So Postgres is not special. It's simply a template for all the databases. Well, 39 Berkeley students and staff wrote Postgres with a bunch of help from Larry Rowe and myself. And as was mentioned in the introduction, Joey Hellerstein was there. Turns out Mike Olson, who's now the chairman of the board at Cloudera, was there. Marty Hurst was there. And nothing would have ever happened without these 39 people. Don't think I ever wrote a line of code. I was the project manager. None of this would have been possible. Commercialization, prototype would have required talented Berkeley students and staff, and the commercialization required incredibly talented system programmers, startup executives. These are people who are willing not to have a secretary and make some of the hard choices in the commercial. And of course, money from the land sharks. I've never put a dime into any of these companies. I've not mortgaged my house, and I have no intention of doing so. And of course, none of this would have happened without my wife and my family, my daughter Leslie, and as of 2015, my other daughter Sandy, and my wife and I. And I'm not sure that Beth realizes that she's largely responsible for keeping me from falling off my own personal cliffs, as well as having to ride rear seat behind across the country. And I want to finish with a shout out to Jim Gray. Jim Gray was the previous database Turing Award winner in 1998. He was lost at sea in 2008, just about a decade ago. Jim was the smartest man I think I ever knew, and was a mentor for me and a guiding light. And I just want to say, Jim, I think all the people in the database research community miss you every day. So thank you very much. There are no more.